Okay, thank you everybody, and welcome. And it's a bit scary being the first presentation of this event, and to kind of cap that off as well, I do not have Sophina Choudry with me, as you can probably tell. Unfortunately, she is not too well today, so I am doing this on my own. And so please bear with me, because Sophina's project, we're talking about two projects, and Sophina's project is not one that I was involved with. So I am literally going to have to basically try and read the slides, I think, to try and kind of get the information. So yeah, this presentation is focusing on the concept of perezhivanie, which is a Russian term, which loosely translated is relates to emotional experiencing or emotional experience. So in our presentation today, we're going to talk to you about how we kind of worked with that idea and then moved it on to something quite different. And then I think Laia is next, and she will also be focusing on perezhivanie as a term. So that's kind of a nice flow with the event. Okay, so this presentation is actually it's based on a book chapter that Sophina and I have been writing on the topic of perezhivanie, and that's for a book which was titled something like Activity Theory, the Learning of Mathematics in the Digital Age. Now, you'll be pleased to know I'm not going to talk about mathematics education hugely in this, and I don't talk about the digital age at all. So, that's where we're at with this, completely winging it. Right. So the chapter was originally, the abstract for the chapter was originally proposed by our late colleague, Professor Julian Williams. It's really appropriate that we open the event by remembering Julian. He passed away last year. Julian's a comrade. He was an advocate of fighting for social justice, an activist, and he's been an inspiration and a mentor to many of us here, actually, and particularly to Sabina and myself, who've worked with him for many, many years. So Julian wrote the abstract, and we were like, oh, right, okay, we'll be co-authors then. And then we were asked to take over writing the chapter when he passed away. So, obviously we don't know what Julian was intending to write in this chapter, and we don't know whether what we've written was anywhere near what he wanted. But we hope we do him justice in this presentation, because he's a very, very dear colleague to us. So the title that we were trying to kind of address, or the question we were trying to address in the chapter, is how do we mobilise praxis for equity in and through mathematics education? And, it's a bit of a niche area, mathematics education, but I always defend my interest in it, because I think it really kind of captures all the wider inequalities and kind of experiences of oppression that we face in schooling, in the education system, and beyond that, right? Bourdieu talks about mathematics as the sharpest tool in the past in terms of how we produce oppression through schooling. And so it kind of brings together all of those kind of problematic areas. And we're particularly interested in understanding oppressive experiences in different forms. So I'm going to talk a bit about a project that I was involved in with Julian and with some other colleagues here in MIE, Manchester, which was looking at and trying to challenge understandings of gender oppression in and through mathematics education. Sabina's part of the presentation, which I will try to talk to, draws on the PACT project, which she undertook, and Erica was involved in that, and then Julian was also involved in it, so you can see the common denominator there, which focused on racialised oppression in Greater Manchester communities during the COVID-19. So our shared concern here is, how do traumatic experiences of oppression become a resource for collective action and change? Perezhivanie. Okay, so this is a hard term to define, and in fact there's quite a lot of arguments in the literature in cultural historical psychology, cultural historical activity theory particularly, about what it actually means and how you operationalize it. So theoretically, we tend to always go back to Vygotsky on this, who kind of used the term in some of his work on the psychology of art, particularly in a lecture that he gave towards the end of his life, which was called The Problem of the Environment. And in that quote there on the left-hand side, you can see really what he's harnessing into, which is the idea that the person or the child and the environment are always in a relational unity with one another. So in that problem of the environment lecture, he talks about children, a group of children who are living with an alcoholic mother, and he talks about how their kind of experiencing of that traumatic situation differs for each child, depending on the kind of unique constellation of the child and the environment in a unity. So that's kind of the starting point, and which most of the literature on perezhivanie, draws on these quotes here. But in the chapter, we also use the work of Vasiliuk, and we rely more heavily on that, mainly because he used the concept to talk about emotional crises in therapeutic situations and relating to adults particularly. So Vasiliuk talks about kind of moments of crisis, moments of kind of critical life events and trauma that create an impossibility for the subject, such that something has to change, some kind of meaning making has to change for the subject in relation to the environment in order to overcome or address that impossibility. It involves working through over time. It's the unity of the emotional experience and reflection on that. So it's not something that just happens as a kind of an event. It's an event plus the working through over time in therapy. And in Vasiliuk's work, it's very much about kind of the therapeutic activity as a looking at that activity and how it develops perezhivanie over time. I'm sure there was more things I wanted to say about perezhivanie at this point, but I can't remember them, so I will just move on. Okay, so the non-binary maths project that I was involved in was a project that we set up to really kind of challenge conversations and dialogue about gender oppression in mathematics education. So I'm sure you're aware, in maths education, there are very kind of strong stereotypes that operate around gender, about who can and do mathematics, who belongs in mathematics. There's a critique of mathematics as a kind of white, cis, heteronormative male domain. But much of that work really rests on a kind of binary construct of gender, male and female, a cis-binary construct. And so we really wanted to kind of push against that and look at kind of different stories about gender in our research. That the discipline has been really hamstrung by deficit notions, like what's wrong with girls, why are there no female mathematicians, And we really wanted to kind of push against that. So we worked with a group of students who all identify in ways that do not conform to a cis-binary gender of male-female. And we worked with that group of students because we thought that they would give us some really interesting stories about gender. They've done a lot of thinking about gender through their school career, and they would give us some new stories to tell about that. So I'm just going to in the chapter, we focused on one of the students who chose the pseudonym Dust. All our students chose their own pseudonym. Dust identifies as monstrous non-binary. That's the expression of that, which is fabulous. They use they, them pronouns, so I'll try to keep to that. And in the chapter, we focus on 3 kind of events that Dust talked to us about. Thank you. So, right, let me think, where am I going with this? Right, okay, yes. We've had a couple of interviews with Dust, and it was very, very rich and kind of, these conversations were incredible, really. In fact, all the conversations we had with our students were quite emotionally challenging for us as a team, and there is an element of perezhivanie about us in a research team and how that shifted our own understandings of gender and our own subjectivity in relation to gender as well. So in the chapter, we focused on these kind of 3 events here. The first is comment that you can see there. I might just give you 1 or 2 seconds to read it. So Dust said to us, it's supposed to be a big change. It just didn't there was this big argument, and then I didn't talk to most of the people after that. So they're referring to their experiences of coming out at the age of 16 as non-binary. And they expected that to be a big moment of celebration where they finally got to be themselves in their friendship group. And there was no reaction. This is quite a common story. People didn't respond. They didn't, criticize or negatively react. They just didn't react. And they felt very underwhelmed by that. And that then led to tension in the group and, a kind of shift in friendship groups as a result of that. The second two quotes relate to the difficulty, the challenge, the emotional trauma of being identifying as non-binary in a space where there is no room for that identity to be. So the second quote relates to going to a female-only college, the university. So being a non-binary mathematician in a female-only space where you're supposed to be a cis woman is, the impossibility that creates. And then the third quote there relates to certain kinds of EDI initiatives, equality, diversity, and inclusion initiatives in mathematics that are really pushed at women and non-binary people together, And they're saying, I get invited to these spaces that are really meant for cis women. And there's this impossibility of not being able to find a space to be a non-binary mathematician in those events. So it's kind of, these are three events that we kind of talked about as perezhivanie. And what we noticed from this, and this is kind of where we start to move away from the literature that we've looked at previously on the concept, is that there's clearly not one single event here of trauma, like, living with an alcoholic mother. There's a series of different events or traumatic experiences that are overlapping, provoking a range of impossibilities that require some working through. We also noticed how the interview itself between me, another researcher, Kate O'Brien, who was our postdoc, and Dust, how that was actually, the activity of the interview was doing something, creating this space to bring these issues to consciousness, these traumatic difficulties, and then reflect on that. And one of the ways we saw that kind of really shifting things along was when, in relation to this third quote here, just starts to talk about these events as being problematic, and I then reformulate that and say, so it's almost like you're telling me that women in maths events, designed to promote inclusion, are actually part of the problem. That they're actually causing other forms of exclusion. And in response to that, then Duff kind of shifts up a gear in terms of thinking about how can they, talking about it in a more abstract level, let's say, thinking about how non-binary mathematicians get tagged onto these events, and talking about it as an aspect of inclusion. So there was a kind of reformulation that kind of moved it on, and the activity itself was part of that. And then lastly, the key thing, which I think I've already mentioned, was that, we began to realise very clearly from doing these interviews that we had really undervalued the emotional trauma and experience that all of our interviewees had experienced through school, where there were, not just in relation to Just, but there were examples of quite, challenging transphobia in schools, but also in universities. One student had to move universities because of transphobia. And it became kind of really obvious that we couldn't divorce any of that from the experience of being math students as well. So, yeah. Okay, right. So I'm going to quickly skip this bit because I've already said most of it anyway. But the third point here is the one that I want to really focus on, the idea of working through. So in much of the literature on perezhivanie, there's this idea of overcoming. You have an emotional experience, you reflect on it, and then you overcome that through that kind of process of reflection with others. That was problematic to us because overcoming, no, that doesn't happen, does it? We don't overcome oppression, right? So we began to think about working through as a kind of non-linear process, with no fixed point or end resolution. You know, dust is still oppressed. We are still oppressed in relation to them. So although there may be kind of shifts in the qualitative meaning that you assign to that experience, we rejected very clearly the idea of overcoming through our use of the concept. Okay. So the PACT project, this is difficult now because this is not my project. Erica is here, so she may want to jump in with some explanation. She was involved in the, as a co-I on the project. But this project, Sophina did, which was designed to kind of understand racialized experiences of oppression during COVID-19, particularly working with British Pakistani communities in Greater Manchester. Sophina began to talk, I think, to Erica and Julian about kind of the dissatisfaction of the way that those communities were being represented in the media during COVID-19. And so they developed this project to try and understand that, particularly in relation to schools and education. That was the original motive of the project, to look at that in relation. And what they found very kind of, immediately almost, was that people that they were working with and interviewing resisted that focus on schooling and pushed back against it. And they said, well, you know, this is racialized oppression. It's endemic. It's racism. So Luckman here on the left is talking about, you know, his whole kind of experience of racism through childhood. You know, as a child playing football and encountering racism on the football pitch. And he's saying, you know, this is endemic. This is systemic. You know, it's not something that is just kind of coming to the fore in COVID-19. So Sophina says here that Luckman refused to confine his experience to schooling during the pandemic. His resistance to the research frame was itself an enactment of agency, demonstrating that petitioning those in power is inadequate when power itself is the problem. Great. Yeah. And then she also draws on Samira, another participant, who talked about, she says, us Asian women, she's talking to Sophina here, are usually in a lockdown. That's the normal state of things, right? But now I feel even more depressed. You know, you are even scared of your own shadow. So Samira's account here is not about the pandemic and not about education either. It intensified already existing feelings of alienation, patriarchal constraint, racialized poverty, and community isolation all at once. So all of the participants in the PACT project said that this is not about schooling. Racism is everywhere. It's across every site for health, media, policy, education. And it's historically rooted and continuously reproduced. So for Sophina, the concept of perezhivanie in relation to an individual was no longer sufficient. And this was also the case in the non-binary maths project, where we rejected this idea of linear working through as well. So Luckman's 50 years survival of racism could not be understood as a single person's working through of a perezhivanie. It's a historical, structural, collective experience. She also wanted to talk to you about the co-participants' epistemological authority in the project. I believe as the project developed, the team began to see this resistance not as a form of obstruction, but as a way of exerting epistemological authority in the project and taking control of that. And the importance of recognizing co-participants' rights to redefine the research agenda, that's really central to that work that Sophina and Erica and Julian have been doing. So she talks about how the activity itself shifted in light of these comments. It moved away from this kind of call to action, which is focused on schooling, and towards much more widespread calls to action to challenge racism across different kinds of institutions. So we moved here from the idea of individual perezhivanie towards an argument for collective perezhivanie. So the first two steps here would probably describe where we got to in the non-binary maths project. Pretty much. But as we get towards the later is where we've kind of shifted the concept in light of our reflections, both on the non-binary maths project, but particularly in relation to the PAC project as well. So we began to think about how we might harness perezhivanie as kind of a collective set of experiences, not as isolated events, and then use that to establish joint action. So in Sophina's case, it was about the co-production of these calls to action documents, which were about challenging systemic racism and collective survival. They, I believe, sent these calls of action out to 350 different schools, colleges, media organisations, health-related institutions, and local politicians. Demanding that they challenge these deficit narratives around racism. That led to interest from over 40 different kinds of community organisations who wanted the team to go and talk to them about that. And one of the things that Sophina wanted to share with you today was that, on the back of that, even just a small example, Sophina still lives in the communities that were being researched as part of that project. And she has noticed that one of the calls to action that was kind of included in those documents was, that the co-participants noticed that there was this kind of, contradiction between the representation of minority, ethnic and racialized minorities within the teaching staff of schools and the demographics of the pupils in those schools. And what she's seen is a wider racial representation in primary schools, particularly in those communities that she's been working with 5 years on. Okay, I think that is probably enough from me. We move from this idea of individual perezhivanie to collective perezhivanie. We see the theory here as a response to community knowledge rather than being imposed on it. It's a concept that we have changed in order to address the voices of those people we have spoken to. Okay, I'm going to go quickly over that. Okay, thank you very much.